For me, I know that a lot of diaspora give back financially. That is something that I have always been doing, even when I lived in Pakistan. And I just moved back to Canada after spending a few years there. And so there's that giving back element in terms of supporting different causes, which I think is also a fantastic way of building domestic resources within the country. And it's also talking about issues, creating information about what is going on in that country, becoming an advocate for causes, pushing for rights in that country. Again, none of that is easy to do from so far away as well. But what I try to do is at least enhance awareness about what the real Pakistan is, It's not what you see in the media. There's a lot more behind it too. So I think as diaspora, that is our responsibility. And if you can leave and go back, but then go back as a human being. Don't go back as somebody who has, made a lot of money and a name for themselves and, has a comfortable nest egg in another country and then can pick up and leave at any point. That way, I think it's better if you just contribute it financially and just continue to raise awareness about your country where you are.
I'm your host, Soraya Sinozie, and this is Diaspora and Development, where we give voice to people of the diaspora working in international development. My guest today is Themrise Khan. Themrise is an independent development professional and researcher with almost 30 years of practitioner and policy-based experience in international development, aid effectiveness, gender, and global migration. She has worked with a vast spectrum of multilateral and bilateral organizations, INGOs, and civil society organizations, primarily in Pakistan, but also in Canada and South Asia. Themrise has written a number of publications and articles on aid, humanitarianism, and development. She's co-editor of the book White Saviorism in International Development, Theories, Practices, and Lived Experiences. She blogs, speaks, and writes actively on notions of national autonomy, North-South power imbalances in development, race relations, and migrant and refugee rights. Her years of working in international development have led her to question not just the effectiveness of international development, but its very existence. Our conversation jumps right into aid and foreign policy. Let's get into it. Last year, you wrote an article about how aid can no longer be dictated by foreign policy. This wasn't always the case. Under the Harper government in Canada, I remember when the Canadian International Development Agency was shuttered and there was no longer a pretense to separate aid from foreign policy. Can you explain why aid needs to be separate and provide any examples of why this could work well?
So foreign aid is, and always has been, since the end of World War II, a very vital component of foreign policy, because it was the way a lot of post-war economies were able to get back on their feet, or had the opportunity to do that because of post-war rebuilding. So there was a lot of post-war rebuilding in Europe. That was the primary focus. And then there was the end of colonial rule in many parts of the world. So South Asia, for instance, India and Pakistan gained freedom in 1947, which was soon after World War II. But we were highly dependent on the Americans and the British to support then our journey further. Not necessarily political, but definitely economic. And that was a vital part of the foreign policy of the United States and the UK, basically to sort of quote unquote help its post-colonial nations to, get back onto their feet after hundreds of years of ruling them and controlling them. So there was the irony that was right there, that foreign aid wasn't an independent tool. It was attached to this very, very long history of control. And that, as much as you say that foreign aid is independent, a lot of government departments in Canada as well, foreign aid comes under the departments of international affairs. So global affairs, Canada, for instance, that which was CEDA, international development, and foreign affairs are part of the same department and have been for many years. And you say that you see the same in the UK and some other countries. And so that influence of countries wanting relationships with certain other countries because it benefits them, because that's what foreign policy is all about, is also what dictates aid. So if you want better relations, and we saw this in Pakistan during 9/11, after 9/11, that, the whole Afghanistan issue and the Taliban issue, when that came up, USAID, then DFID, poured millions and millions and millions of dollars into Pakistan on the pretext of fighting terrorism. and counterterrorism. And that was a foreign policy that they had instituted because, they needed to counter the effects of the Taliban. And that connection was indelible. The money only came in for that reason. It didn't come in because, girls' education was vitally important for any country to begin with. So, you have those connections that have been going to foreign policy in foreign aid since its inception. And I don't think you can divorce that. But that's where we have to start. Everybody says foreign aid is altruistic. No, it's not altruistic. It's connected to a political agenda of a country that's giving it, as well as the political agenda of the country that's receiving it. We don't receive aid in our countries only because people are throwing money at us. We also accept it because we want the leverage of being connected to powerful countries that may help us politically later on. Of course, it damages us more than it does help us, but we have an agenda too, and it's all foreign policy related.
And so when we're looking at foreign aid, you see no avenue where there are benefits for the people of the country who are in need of this aid?
That's an interesting question because I do get, even in Pakistan, with a number of my senior colleagues there are people who are entirely convinced that no foreign aid is needed. And without it, our countries would not be able to function. To a certain extent, I'm not agreeing with it, but to a certain extent, I see the logic in that because there have been a lot of programs that have introduced a number of interesting measures that, if done the way more contextually connected to our own environments, would actually have some benefit. So the idea, let's say, human rights or women's freedoms, these are universal. Right? So every country needs to pursue those regardless of who is assisting us in it. But the idea is that we should try and make that our own as much as possible. But any sort of assistance in terms of, let's say, best practices in other countries or providing us with some knowledge and information would always be very helpful. Right? You need to know what's going on in other parts of the world to see whether or not it would fit into your own context. So that is very useful. And some of that has been useful in the past. But I think more and more that you see that utility declining. You see a lot of it going into very, very projectized approaches that are very short-term fixes and have no accountability at the end of the day. So I think that's, we're talking about, utility versus the need. Right. And one thing I'd like to say that we always need to make a distinction between what we're calling development aid and humanitarian aid.
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference that we need to make. So humanitarian aid, which is suffering from its own issues right now as well, just like it is an indelible part of development aid, but humanitarian aid is different, right? Humanitarian aid is required essentially in a lot of cases. So I'm not advocating to, reduce
humanitarian aid.
This is the development sector that we're talking about. So I think that distinction needs to be made very, very clearly.
Yes, we've had conversations with other people who work in humanitarian aid. And as you mentioned, humanitarian aid has its own issues. But there is. In the book you edited, White Saviorism in International Development, you wrote a chapter on the matriarchy complex. White feminist disruption in development. Can you tell me why you chose to write about this? And can you explain what matriarchy complex is and why it's harmful to international development?
So the matriarchy complex is a pun on patriarchy, right? So we talk about patriarchy all the time. But there is something called matriarchy as well, right? So we know what matriarchs are, female heads of households and, powerful women. But I sort of used that as a pun to say that it's not just men, and in our particular context, white men, who come in and, tell us how to do development. It's also white women who do that. And so it's not only about patriarchy in certain cases, it's about matriarchy. Women are as responsible for a lot of what the sector is perpetuating as much as their male counterparts are. And I think this is something, because we're so sensitive towards the issue of gender and women being marginalized and subjugated and dominated, that we don't actually realize that, a lot of women do have, they're as much part of this system as men are, right? And white women in particular. So my work, Pakistan, a lot of it has been spent working with a lot of foreign consultants, white female consultants, aid workers, expats who have come from the global north to Pakistan to work work. And I was, linked to them professionally in many ways. A lot of them, I have to say, are still my friends, particularly people who lived in Pakistan for many years. But there is this denial that we do not see some of the harm that they perpetuate, because they look down on us and they patronize us in exactly the same way as their male counterparts do. And in many cases, a lot of cases, that's worse, right? For it coming for a woman, especially if you're working in the sector that's looking at gender, right? Mm-hmm. You've got, these white women coming in, their heads covered with a chadar and wearing a shalwar kameez and thinking they're blending in, and coming into girls' schools and talking to them. And we've seen pictures of women surrounded by Black African children and, in South Asia. And it's not how it seems to be. And a lot of these women don't realize the harm that they're perpetuating. Mm-hmm. The chapter also looks at the fact that it's not just white women, it's women who come from the global north in general, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got a lot of racialized women who have been born and brought up in the global north. And as far as they're concerned, they're global north. And even they come into our context and behave in exactly the same way, because it's a mindset, right? They represent this really rich white donor, mm-hmm. and they represent this rich white country. So it's not their race that's the problem. It's the mindset of power that they're bringing with them. Mm-hmm. And so that's something that I spoke to a lot of women in this sector about their experiences. And many of them said the same thing. A lot of them said, well, Latin American women treat us worse in Pakistan than, let's say, women who come from an African background, mm-hmm. or vice versa, right? Or switch it. So, the idea of women in development, Western women in particular, mm-hmm. is something that we don't look at. We ignore that because of our tendency to forgive anything that's gender related because of the power dynamics and the patriarchy. But that's not the case.
It's an interesting concept, because, as you know, this is called diaspora and development. And the idea is that women of the diaspora perhaps have a different approach to development. But it's an interesting proposal, because a lot of us are living in the Western world and going to do development in other countries, and sometimes even our parents' countries. So it's an interesting conversation. And I think that also leads to disenchantment for some people, because they do think they're going to make things better and then realize that either sometimes they're not equipped or they have preconceived ideas because they come from the Western world. That's an interesting...
Absolutely. No, that's very true. We always assume that if we go back to our home country, we'll be received willingly because, we are also, Kenyan or Pakistani. I mean, I faced that in Pakistan. Once you live and imbibe the identity of a foreign country and you come back, everybody's like, well, why are you back? You left the country.
And you think you understand. There are many situations where you realize that you don't understand, particularly if you're urban and then you go to a rural part of your country. There's a lot of, it's a very interesting conversation.
It is. Definitely is.
In your opinion, does international development just not work? Are there any examples of success stories?
So like I said earlier, I personally look at it I have begun to look at it pretty much as black and white, as in either it works or it doesn't. And I think it doesn't. It wasn't the case earlier in my career. There, I think it was the other extreme that says it works, right? And then realizing the gaps in it, you start looking at it more closely. And there was a point in between where I was considering leaving, but I didn't. I stuck on, where I'm like, well, maybe it could work. Right. And then I veer towards, no, it doesn't work. And the reason I say that is because I think when you're talking about what a lot of people are calling systems change, it's not about changing systems. It's about actually completely eradicating those systems and starting from scratch. And starting from scratch doesn't mean, which a lot of people interpret as building on the same foundations, but building something new, for instance. It's actually building something entirely different, right? So if we scrap foreign aid, which is what I'm in favor of, and again, not humanitarian, only development aid, there are many, you don't have to replace it with a new form of aid. You can replace it with a number of existing systems that you can work on making better. There are resources, for instance, like taxation in countries, better resource mobilization, looking at diaspora giving, for instance, looking at how charity works in other countries, right? So we're not looking at creating another foreign aid institution. We're looking at how countries can leverage existing resources to their benefit without anybody else coming in and giving them money on their terms.
Mm-hmm.
So that is where I feel it should end, because that system will only create, different ways of doing the same thing.
I see. In the idea that foreign aid sometimes is tied to the promotion of democracy or the promotion of capitalism, if you look at it that way, do you think that there can be change to international development the way you propose it?
Again, a really good question. I'm not sure. Right now, my brain is geared towards the fact that no, it can't, right? Maybe as time goes on, there may be another option, but I doubt it because, capitalism, materialism, all these also govern aid in many ways, right? So the entire incentive system that aid creates, for instance, in terms of the employment opportunities it generates, is unequal because it generates that just for one particular side, not the other. Right. So, and you see that not just in foreign aid, you see that in anything that sees the global north taking the lead over the global south. Right. I just did a vlog on development studies as a discipline in academia, and it doesn't go both ways. Right. So you do not see academia from the global south coming across to the global north and actually being involved in their academia. You see it the other way around. And so that's a one-sided. And aid is the same way. It's very one-sided. You will not see an aid agency in a global south country. You'll only see it in the global north. And so you have that one-sidedness, which basically takes over, right? And the idea of not having foreign aid is to end this one-sidedness, to know and understand that every country does have an institution that is capable of managing its own development and resources. And once they're at that level where they are providing support to their own country's growth, then you can have exchanges between countries because everybody will be at a similar level. Right now, you're talking about a level that's way up there and one that's way down there.
Yeah, very hierarchical.
Very hierarchical. So no, I don't think capitalism will ever die because that's what controls everything in this world, everything from war to politics to, democracy and have you. And because of that, all our institutions will be influenced in some way or another all over the world, not just in the North, but in the South as well. So it's a tall order.
It is. You also look at migration, climate change, wars, and economic disparity. And these things continue to drive immigration. However, despite international treaties, countries around the world are becoming increasingly hostile to immigrants. Why do you think that is?
So I think migration is, again, something connected directly to capitalism, right? We need migrants because, we don't have, take Canada, for example. We're a country, they say, that was built by migrants. And we need immigrants because we don't have enough people in the country. So there is an economic value attached to it. It's not just a head count or a demographic number. It's about the fact that we need more people to contribute to the economy financially. And I've always seen migration in the global north as being marketed in that way. So, we need country because migrants and refugees even are good for business. That's the case that's always put forward. And people who migrate also do this for financial reasons in almost all cases. Yes, a better life is there socially and politically and in terms of, personal safety, but it's also primarily economic. So if you have economics driving migration, then you also have the idea of then who controls those economic resources and how much of it do we actually give the migrants? And that, I think, brings in this tussle. Because countries they want people in, but then they don't want to give them back too much. They just want them to keep giving to us. And that's why Canada increased suddenly, we want 1 million migrants in the next 3 years because, we need people and we need their money and we'll need the skills that they will bring in and how much they will contribute to our taxations and infrastructure and all that. But we won't give them anything in return. So we won't even give them basic necessities like, housing or health or employment opportunities. They're on their own own once they're in the countries, but they need to contribute, right? And it doesn't work that way. And so now we're seeing this clawback of, no, now we don't want migrants because, they're messing up our societies and economies, and they're bringing in crime, and they're bringing in et cetera, et cetera. But you're the ones who started in the first place.
Mhm.
And so I think that tussle and that pushback, plus there's also the ideological approach, right? Particularly in Europe, that, it's just, no, we're not going to have anyone who's non-white in our midst because it is, diluting our white supremacy and Anglo-Saxon identity or whatever it is you call. So there are both these economic and ideological facets that have made migration such a hot button topic. And I don't think that was ever the case. I came in as a migrant over 20 years ago to this country, and none of those issues I was faced with. I mean, yes, there was a little bit of racism, yes. But, it's the issues that migrants face today, both formal and informal migrants, regular and irregular migrants. I don't think they faced that 20 years ago. And I think that's where we are today, that the world has become so capitalistic, and power hungry that everything is being used as a means to an end for only the powerful.
What are some of your career highs and lows? And what did you learn from them?
Career highs, I would say, is traveling, observing, and trying to understand the length and breadth of my country, Pakistan. So my work took me to we have 4 provinces in the country, all very distinct and different. And I traveled, to parts of those provinces that I would never otherwise have been exposed to. And I met people from walks of life that I would never have met otherwise. And that exposed me to, not just the people, but the issues that they faced, how they lived. I mean, we are very urban people in cities, right? For us, everything is out there. So to actually see the out there as a reality that exists was eye-opening for me. And I learned so much. I think it made me what I am today. So I think that has been the biggest career high for me. Understanding and being exposed to my own people. The career low was the fact that I really wasn't able to do much for them. And that is probably because of attitude and perception, regardless of how much I learned and observed them and their way of life, which was very different to mine, regardless of us all being Pakistanis. I was not able to bring them to a level closer to at par with, a lot of us or the global perception of what equality is. And that's also what led to my disillusionment with the sector. So, and the fact that a lot of the people I worked with, the donors, were not really interested in making Pakistan better. This was a job for them. It was a job posting. And they were going to be here 3 years. They're going to go move on to another country. They were really not interested. They were like, I'm here to do a job. Let's just do it. And here I am. This is my people you're talking about. These are real levels. So that was the low point.
I understand why that's the low. And I think that's the low for many people. After years of work, you don't see a lot of change. That can certainly lead to disenchantment.
And then we're blamed for that, right? Oh God, you have bad governance, you have political problems, instability, all that. It's your fault. It's all your fault. We didn't do anything, So
as a child of Haitian immigrants, this is what I hear.
It's all your fault.
Indeed. Do you have any heroes and people you admire in this field, and who are they and why?
I do have one. He's no longer with us, and it's in the humanitarian field. We had a extremely powerful and humble personality in Pakistan known as Maulana Abdul Sattar Idi. And he was just a very, very normal poor man who started the Idi Foundation, humanitarian foundation under his name, to just literally help the poor in Pakistan. It started off in Karachi with my city, and it has grown to become a global phenomenon. So the Idi Foundation, it was family run. It was a husband and wife, and they were the humblest of people. They had no massive income. Everything was based on donations and charity. So this man would wash dead bodies of the derelict and the dispossessed and bury them. He would pick up dead animals or the injured and the hungry. They opened orphanages, women's shelters, donation centers. I mean, it's come to the point that they had free ambulances all over the cities. That if something happened there was a catastrophe anywhere in the city or the country, the ED Foundation ambulances and volunteers would be there first before anyone else. They would be there on the scene, digging through rubble, pulling people out. I don't want to call it an empire because it's not an empire. I think it defines Pakistan and who we are. Until his very death, the man wore only one pair of clothes and he never took massive media interviews. We wanted him nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for his work. He was the Mother Teresa of Pakistan, but it never got to that. And he passed away a few years ago. His son now and his widow, they continue with the legacy. And all the volunteers, all the orphans that they brought up in their orphanages are now actually, they work in the foundation.
Oh, wow.
They're all volunteers now running the foundation at different levels. And it's massive. I mean, they even sent help to Hurricane Katrina in the US.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And very few people know that, but they offered to send aid and help, So he truly is an icon and a hero and never got the respect and the admiration that he deserved in Pakistan, which goes to show you how capitalistic and materialistic we are, that, somebody as a humanitarian like him never got the respect that he deserved.
Thank you for highlighting him. We'll put his name in the notes and any information that you have about him. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I love this show. So it's funny, I'm going to ask you this question anyways, but what advice would you give people who want to work in international development?
Okay, so here we go. Don't work in international development. That's my advice. I can't say anything else. I mean, with my, perception, you should know that I'm not a fan of the field. Mm-hmm. And I think anyone who wants to join in the field really is perpetuating a lot of it. So a lot of students ask me, and I did a course in Pakistan on ODA, the impact of overseas development assistance in Pakistan in a private university. And it was all about, aid is contradictory. Right? And I did, this was a 3-month-long, semester-long course that I was doing. And at the end of it, my students asked me, ma'am, can you give us a list of NGOs in Islamabad that we can look to for jobs? And I was like, did you not hear a word that I was saying? This is not a sector that is doing, but, there's that perception that there's money in it. Mm-hmm. So no, please don't, because I think the more people that join the sector, even if you think you can change it or that you want to do something differently or that you want to fight against it, don't join it. Mm-hmm. Do it from the outside. So that's the advice I would give. Please don't join it.
Don't join it. Do it from the outside. But if you want to make a change in your country's development, what would you say?
I know that's a rough one because a lot of our countries don't provide the opportunities that we, particularly the youth, are looking for, right? That's why a lot of youth are leaving. They're coming this side because our countries are not giving them those opportunities or the future that they deserve. Mm-hmm. Most of them can't leave because they don't have the resources to do it, which is another myth of migration that, everybody's going to leave. But no, everybody can't leave. Only mm-hmm. people like I can leave. It's a privilege to be able to leave.
Talk about that. There are refugees, even refugees who are leaving. One of the things I realize that in some countries, the poorest of the poor cannot leave. They don't leave. Mm-hmm.
They can't. Mm-hmm. They can't. Even this whole myth of climate migration, I think it's a myth. And you must read the work of Dr. Hein de Haas, who's written a book on this. He's a migration scholar from the Netherlands. It's a myth. Right? It's because most people cannot leave. And if they leave within their borders. Mm-hmm. They don't move across borders, right? And eventually they all want to go back home. We had floods in Pakistan, some of the worst the country's ever seen about 3 years ago. There was a masses of displacement. But they all eventually went back when the waters receded because where else could they go? So this idea that climate is going to push millions of people across the border is entirely false. So, there are all these myths that we need to now counter, definitely.
And so, yes, so if you want to make a change.
We want to make a change in our country. My advice would be stick to it as much as you can. I was a coward. I left. Mm-hmm. I had the privilege to leave, so I did. And a lot of that haunts me. Most of my life, I have a 100% connection to Pakistan because my family still lives there. Mm-hmm. I'm very much a Pakistani, but I don't work in the sector in Pakistan anymore because I think that is a sham. It's a complete eyewash. Mm-hmm. I don't work in the sector anywhere at that level anymore. But there are a lot of people who want to make a change at the grassroots in particular. And the only way they can do that is try and ride it out and fight it out. And it's not easy because the resistance they are getting is enormous, and a lot is dangerous as well. But the only way you can make change in your country is that you've got to let this resistance to the existing system build. And that's not easy for many people to do, but that is the only way out. And I think because most people can't leave, at some point they will have to figure out what to do.
And what about a diaspora like you? What can you do?
Well, for me, I know that a lot of diaspora give back financially. That is something that I have always been doing, even when I live in Pakistan. And I just moved back to Canada after spending a few years there. And so there's that giving back element in terms of supporting different causes, which I think is also a fantastic way of building domestic resources, right, within the country. And it's also talking about issues from afar, right? Creating information about what is going on in that country, becoming an advocate for causes, pushing for rights in that country. Again, none of that is easy to do from so far away as well. But what I try to do is at least enhance awareness about what the real Pakistan is. You know, it's not what you see in the media. There's a lot more behind it too. So I think as diaspora, that is our responsibility. And if you can leave and go back, but then go back as a human being. Don't go back as somebody who has, made a lot of money and a name for themselves and, has a comfortable nest egg in another country and then can pick up and leave at any point. That way, I think it's better if you just contribute it financially and just continue to raise awareness about your country where you are. It's a tough call, but I hope to at least continue giving to causes in Pakistan that matter to me. And because I know who to give to and I know they'll be used properly. And also to continue talking about issues in Pakistan and highlighting and building it and advocating for them in any way that I can.
Thank you. I think we'll end on that note. Thanks for joining us, Themrise.
Not at all, Soraya. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Join us every first Tuesday of the month. Don't forget to like us, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and find us on Instagram and on our website if you'd like to be featured as a guest or have any recommendations for guests. We look forward to hearing from you.